Hola amigos, this is Level 12 and today we are going to talk about what Akame ga Kill gets wrong about death. So, recently I finally finished watching Akame ga Kill after originally watching the first 14 episodes as they aired on Adult Swim back in 2014. Because this anime aired on Adult Swim and had an eye-catching art style, it quickly became popular. However, despite it being popular, it did not escape the earned criticism for its story and infamous death toll. Now, before we continue, I would like to say the anime aired in 2014, but the manga did not finish until 2016. So the anime was obviously rushed, but as someone that rarely goes back to read the manga, I think it's fair to judge it based on its anime merits. So before we can start discussing what it gets wrong about death, we need to establish what makes a good death. And for the purpose of this video, we're only going to be talking about the protagonist's death. In my opinion, a good death happens to establish that death is prevalent in the series and grounds the viewer in reality. The character has come to a fitting end and death is the logical next step. The death scene is handled properly and their death has some lasting impact on the living characters. The first death we witness in the series is the death of Tatsumi's two companions from his home village. The girl is tortured to death and strung up while the guy lives long enough to give Tatsumi some exposition about their killer. I consider these deaths to be good deaths as it gives Tatsumi motivation to kill the rich girl that Night Raid is after and shows him the corruption of the capital, which leads to him joining Night Raid. Even though we as an audience didn't get to know these characters, their deaths made sense and we could still empathize with Tatsumi over their deaths. The next death we have to talk about is Shell's. Just a few episodes prior, we got Shell's tragic backstory and how she ended up joining Night Raid. Not only that, but we see her comforting Tatsumi as he is still grieving for his friends. Clearly, we as audience members are attached to her. The setup for her death is actually pretty good. Instead of killing Saru and Sarah, Shell instead goes to save her friend Mine before getting shot by Sarah and eventually eaten by Sarah's Imperial arms. Her death seems to come out of left field, but shows the audience that even the characters considered strong can die. It shows the real dangers of the world. And we as audience members are heavily impacted by her death. We just saw her comforting Tatsumi not an episode earlier. In my opinion, this is one of the best deaths in the series. The next death is Bulat. Now, I am indeed conflicted on Bulat's death because of how he died, but his death served an important purpose for the series. Bulat died at the hands of his former general and teacher, when she has some interesting story potential there. However, he did not die in battle or because he was overwhelmed. He was poisoned, which feels incredibly quick for a man that seems so powerful. It felt quick and cheap. It was not a satisfying death to watch on screen. On the other hand, however, Tatsumi needed an Imperial arms, and what better Imperial arms than that of his former training coach? We've seen how Tatsumi and Bulat bonded, so it would only make sense that his Imperial arms is in Curcio. And Tatsumi continues to honor the legacy of Bulat in his training, so his death did mean something, just the way he died is a little bit annoying. The next major death we have to talk about is that of Chelsea. Now, I will say, after having pretty much back-to-back deaths of Shell and Bulat, they waited a while to kill Chelsea off. I think the cooldown period between deaths is also important because it keeps the viewer in a state of suspense and doesn't desensitize them as much as death after death would. So Chelsea's character started off as very standoffish. She was very skeptical of the group's caring attitude and how they carried themselves. She obviously had the skill to back it up, and she only really softened to Tatsumi the longer she was on screen, yet she was also cocky. This cockiness would lead to her death as she tried to kill Kurame. She overestimated how effective her killing method was, leading her to die by Kurame's hands. So I think we all could pretty much assume Chelsea died by Kurame's hands, right? However, I don't think any of us could have imagined her head would be put on a pike in a town square. Other than Shell's death, this is probably one of the most gruesome death scenes in Akame ga Kill. And while her own hubris is the cause of her death, was the traumatic discovery really worth it? I think, considering we already know death can take anyone out, Chelsea got a really short end of the stick. even if I didn't like her and I thought the framing of the scene was cool, I think they went a little overboard with it. And considering characters continue to act recklessly, putting the whole of Night Raid at risk sometimes, it seems like a disgrace to Chelsea. Her dying felt alright, but the manner in which she died felt like a lot. Now we have to talk about Lubbock. Surprisingly, I really liked Lubbock. I thought his Imperial Arms was cool, and I loved his character design. His personality was a hit or miss for me. However, Lubbock really got the short end of the stick. From the beginning, Lubbock always seemed like a side character, so when they started knocking people off, I figured it would only be a matter of time before we got his tragic backstory, and he died. He lasted longer than I thought he would, honestly, but they really gave this man no character. Unlike other members of Night Raid, Lubbock did not have a tragic backstory. He was the son of a rich noble and only gave up that life to follow Najenda because he loved her. Yet he still thirsts after every girl in the show. That part's super frustrating. And while Lubbock had a really cool Imperial Arms, it was more of a defense weapon versus everyone else having an offensive weapon. Now, this kind of goes with his super laid-back personality, but it made him appear a lot weaker than he actually is, considering after his death, they continued to utilize his Imperial Arms. So Lubbock died fighting the worst villain of the show, Saruya, and what makes me most upset about his death is this is not where he originally died in the manga. Lubbock survived this fight in the manga. What I think happened in the anime production is that it was getting close to where the manga was in production, and they didn't know what to do with Lubbock, so they decided to kill him off. He was actually about to kill Saruya when a girl stabbed him in the lower back. Saruya then transports them into space where Lubbock decides to finally snap his heart. Lubbock then returns to Earth, however has run out of string to break his fall. It is reasonable to assume that either the fall or his back injury would kill him, and Lubbock even monologues about this as he falls. Instead of dying gracefully like that, he gets impaled through the gut in front of Tatsumi. In my opinion, while this death could be seen from the very beginning, I didn't like it. It felt really sudden when Lubbock clearly had the upper hand, and in the very end, it was very violent compared to what it could have been. I would have been fine with Lubbock bleeding to death or breaking his neck. Having him impaled is like rubbing salt in the wound. Unnecessarily cruel and unnecessary death all around, especially considering they use some of his explosives in the coming episodes. Mine is the next member to die, and I think this is one of the laziest deaths in the show. We've already seen her sustain a fair amount of injuries when she was fighting Sarah, but her fighting the general was just a bit too much for her. I can't even fully comprehend why she died, considering Tatsumi could have carried her all the way back to base. She had a promise to keep even that she talked about constantly. I 100% think she could have lived until the final battle, but the writers just needed to write her out of the show ASAP. Mine's death really infuriates me because she could have lived with her injuries, and her telling Tatsumi to let her die feels like it goes against her character, who is very fiery and had a zest for life. This death really doesn't add anything to the series. She could have lived during that final battle and nothing would have changed. This was a bad death. Susanoo dies around the same time as mine. His death felt fitting in comparison. With Susanoo technically being Imperial Arms, I don't know many people that got overly attached to him. Like, he looked human, but we all knew he wasn't, so there's a disconnect there. Anyways, he dies fighting Esdeath after Najenda orders for his trump card to be used. I'm pretty sure this was where, like, the third time she used it, which meant she would die, but Susanoo instead used his own life energy and dies after Esdeath stabs his core. Overall, Susanoo's death was pretty lackluster. It wasn't as bad as mine or Lubbock's, but it definitely wasn't as impactful as Shell's or Chelsea's. But Susanoo couldn't be the one to kill Esdeath, and Najenda needed to be there to command the final battle. So it got him out of the way for that. The next death really infuriates me, because they killed off the main character, Tatsumi. I don't even think he was supposed to die where he did, because he pretty much promised mine and Bulat he would fight and live for them. And he didn't even have to die. He purposely overexerted himself to the point where his body just gave out because he was trying to save a handful of people. What infuriates me even more is that Esdeath got to be with him in his last moments. And I like Esdeath. She was dying, froze herself with Tatsumi, and then broke the ice so they could be together forever. It felt like they were just spitting on everything Tatsumi stood for. Tatsumi did not like her. He was prepared to die on the cross for how much he hated her. I think he and Akame together should have been the ones to defeat Esdeath. I'm pretty sure this happens in the manga. And then, if he died, then maybe it would feel okay. But dying and then being frozen for eternity with Esdeath feels horrible. And I'm not saying you can't kill off your main character. One of my favorite video games does this, The Walking Dead. But in that story, we have time to grieve Lee's death before he's gone. We get an entire episode with him before at the very end he's with Clementine and he's telling her goodbye. But he dies on okay terms, and his body is respected in death. Tatsumi dies suddenly, being reckless, and his body is later defiled by Esdeath. Absolutely horrendous. I think Leone's is another one that absolutely infuriates me. The minister destroys her imperial arms with a ring that seems extremely overpowered, and then shoots her in the stomach. Because she doesn't have her imperial arms, she can't heal herself, and she eventually bleeds to death. But not before finding Akame, talking with Akame, and finding her neck of the woods in the capital, and seeing a handful of people. She dies alone in an alley. I hate this. I hate that she died, and I hate how she died. Leone was the first member of Night Raid we and Tatsumi met. She was one of the strongest characters in the series, and one of the most well-rounded. She got her arm cut off, and she still lived after that. I think the writers just didn't know how to wrap Leone's storyline up, and decided the easiest way would be to kill her, which, by the way, is annoying. She could have just as easily been seen owning a small pub or something like Lubbock had. I think what happened was she actually lived in the manga, but everyone else died, so she needed to die as well, which again is annoying. The final death I want to talk about is the Emperor's. Technically, he is not a protagonist, but I wouldn't really call him an antagonist. Even when we were first introduced to him, he seemed more like a misguided puppet rather than evil like the minister. His battle with Tatsumi seemed to solidify his villainhood, however, as he wrecked his own kingdom. But then they chopped the head of a 12-year-old off. I'm speechless. The Emperor doesn't have much of a character to him, but even then, I think the guillotine was a bit much. I think he should have just been banished from the kingdom rather than killed on the merit he was just a child. Killing him kind of sets up this precedent that even if you were manipulated into doing a bad action, you're the one to blame for it. And it bursts the new kingdom in blood of a child. It all feels really wrong to me. So that's it for this video. This is how Akame ga Kill gets death wrong. Again, there were some actual good deaths in here. I will tip my hat, to Akame ga Kill for that. What I can't do, however, is ignore the fact that most of the 30 plus deaths, that's including antagonists by the way, the 30 plus deaths in this series, a lot of them weren't very good. really infuriating stuff. Anyways, tell me what you guys think below in the comments. I don't know how many of you have actually seen Akame ga Kill. It's on Netflix right now. I've just spoiled the entire series for you, but I do recommend it for the visuals alone. It's pretty good. Anyways, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more random fandom. Thanks. Ciao, chicos.